She becomes my queen consort.
And I felt, you're losing people every single time you have those headlines. We all get that there's a really big urgent message.
Just 3 minutes ago, a decision was made behind palace walls that few expected, and even fewer were prepared for. King Charles, a monarch known for caution, continuity, and carefully measured moves, has reportedly taken a step so unexpected that it is already sending tremors through royal circles. This was not a ceremonial adjustment. It was not a symbolic gesture. It was a decision with consequences, personal, institutional, and deeply political. For weeks, there had been quiet tension inside the palace. Conversations held away from microphones. Calendars adjusted without explanation. Advisors unusually divided. And now that tension has surfaced in the form of a choice that alters the balance of power, responsibility, and public perception. What makes this moment so unsettling is not just what was done, but the timing. Why now? And why in this manner? Sources familiar with royal protocol suggest this move was debated intensely, with warnings raised about public reaction and long-term impact. Yet King Charles proceeded. That alone signals resolve and possibly urgency. When a monarch acts against convention, it often means the alternatives were deemed riskier. As reaction begins to ripple outward, one truth is becoming clear. This decision was not made in isolation. It is connected to unresolved pressures, internal strain, and a monarchy navigating one of its most delicate phases in decades. And, as we examine what has been decided and what has been deliberately left unsaid, a far more complex story begins to unfold. One that could redefine King Charles' reign far sooner than anyone anticipated. What makes King Charles' reported decision so shocking is not only its content, but the environment in which it was made. This was not a moment of calm. It came amid rising internal pressure, public uncertainty, and a monarchy already carrying visible strain. Decisions taken under such conditions are rarely symbolic. They are corrective, defensive, and often deeply personal. For months, palace insiders have described an atmosphere of unresolved tension. Not crisis, but imbalance. Routine meetings ran longer than usual. Advisors disagreed more openly. Traditional pathways for consensus began to fracture. In such moments, a monarch is forced to choose between preservation of custom and assertion of authority. According to multiple sources familiar with royal operations, King Charles chose the latter. This decision reportedly followed a series of internal briefings that raised uncomfortable questions about continuity and control. Concerns were voiced about public confidence, long-term stability, and the perception of leadership during uncertainty. While the specifics remain closely guarded, the nature of the response suggests that incremental adjustments were no longer considered sufficient. King Charles has long been viewed as a monarch who prefers evolution over disruption. That reputation makes this moment particularly significant. When someone known for caution takes a decisive step, it signals that existing systems were no longer producing acceptable outcomes. The shock, therefore, lies not just in what was done, but in what failed before it. Those close to the process say the final discussion was tense. Advisors presented contrasting scenarios, each carrying risk. Delay would invite speculation. Action would invite scrutiny. Yet hesitation, according to one source, was no longer an option. The decision was framed as necessary, not desirable, a distinction that reveals its gravity. Timing is another crucial element. This move comes at a point when the monarchy's margin for error is narrow.
Charles said he hoped his experience may give encouragement to others.
Public trust remains strong but fragile. Any perception of indecision could amplify doubts. Acting now, while controversial, may have been viewed as a way to regain narrative control rather than lose it entirely. The ripple effects inside the palace were immediate. Schedules were quietly adjusted. Certain responsibilities were reevaluated. Communication channels tightened. These changes were subtle but deliberate. Institutions like the monarchy rarely move quickly unless compelled by circumstance. Speed, in this context, signals urgency. What also stands out is the absence of ceremonial framing. This was not presented as tradition, duty, or symbolism. Instead, it was treated internally as a structural response. That distinction suggests the decision addresses functionality rather than image, how the monarchy operates. Not just how it appears. Observers note that King Charles' leadership style has always been introspective, shaped by decades of preparation rather than instinct. For him to override convention indicates a belief that the cost of inaction outweighed the cost of controversy. That calculation is revealing. It points to pressures unseen by the public, pressures serious enough to justify disruption. This moment also exposes a generational crossroads. The monarchy is no longer navigating hypothetical futures, it is confronting present realities. Changing expectations, evolving public scrutiny, and internal complexity have converged. King Charles' decision appears to acknowledge that reality directly. Rather than deferring it. Importantly, this is not being treated as a one-off move. Insiders suggest it forms part of a broader recalibration, one that may unfold gradually rather than through dramatic announcements. Today's shock, then, may only be the first visible signal of deeper transformation underway. As news of the decision continues to circulate, reactions remain cautious. There is surprise, yes, but also recognition. Recognition that the monarchy, like any institution rooted in continuity, eventually faces moments where continuity itself must be redefined. King Charles has now placed his authority unmistakably at the center of that process. Whether history views this decision as necessary correction or risky deviation will depend on what follows. But one thing is already certain: the palace is no longer standing still. And that, perhaps more than anything else, explains why this moment feels so profoundly unsettling. The immediate reaction to King Charles' decision was not loud, it was careful. Inside royal circles, surprise gave way to swift recalculation. This was not the kind of move that invites instant applause or outrage. It was the kind that forces everyone involved to pause, reassess positions, and quietly adjust their footing. That alone reveals how consequential it truly is. Within hours, palace operations reflected a subtle shift. Communication lines narrowed. Briefings became more controlled. Certain voices that once carried influence found themselves less central, while others were drawn closer into confidence. Power in institutions like this rarely changes with announcements. It shifts through access. And access, according to those watching closely, has been noticeably reshaped. Advisors who favored gradual change are said to have expressed concern privately, not over the intent, but over the timing. The monarchy is navigating multiple sensitivities at once: public trust, family dynamics, and international perception. Introducing a disruptive decision into that mix carries risk. Yet supporters of the move argue that delay would have compounded those risks, allowing uncertainty to harden into doubt. Beyond palace walls, the public response unfolded in layers. Initial headlines focused on shock, but commentary quickly matured into analysis. Royal observers noted that the decision aligns with a pattern emerging in King Charles' reign: a willingness to act decisively when foundational principles are at stake. This contrasts with earlier expectations that his leadership would remain purely cautious and ceremonial. Media tone reflected that reassessment. Rather than framing the move as impulsive, many outlets emphasized its inevitability. Quiet references to long-standing internal pressures began to surface, suggesting that today's decision resolved tensions that had been building for far longer than publicly understood. The shock, then, lay less in the action itself and more in the confirmation that patience had reached its limit. Public opinion remains divided, but not polarized. Supporters view the decision as evidence of leadership finally stepping forward, asserting clarity where ambiguity had lingered. Critics worry about precedent, whether decisive action now opens the door to further disruption later. Yet even among skeptics, there is acknowledgement that the monarchy could not remain static indefinitely. Internationally, reaction has been measured but attentive. Foreign royal households and diplomatic observers are acutely aware that internal shifts within the British monarchy often carry symbolic weight far beyond the UK. Stability, continuity, and predictability are closely watched. Any sign of internal recalibration invites interpretation. For now, the response suggests curiosity rather than concern. What is particularly striking is how little has been said officially since the initial reports. No follow-up clarification. No attempt to soften interpretation. This silence appears intentional. By allowing the decision to stand without immediate explanation, King Charles is signaling confidence, a willingness to let outcomes rather than words define the move. That approach carries its own message. It suggests that the decision was not crafted for public approval, but for internal necessity. Institutions often struggle when leaders prioritize perception over function. In this case, the emphasis appears reversed. Function came first. Within the palace, the emotional impact is still unfolding. Change, even when necessary, unsettles routines and relationships. Some staff reportedly feel relief, clarity replacing prolonged uncertainty. Others feel disoriented, aware that familiar structures are shifting beneath them. Landscape in lasting ways. There is also a generational dimension to the response. Younger observers tend to interpret the move as modernization through action, while traditionalists worry about erosion of long-held norms. King Charles stands between these perspectives, tasked with honoring legacy while confronting present realities. Today's decision suggests he is no longer content to mediate quietly between them. As hours turn into days, attention will move from reaction to consequence. Who gains influence? Which responsibilities are redefined? How does this affect the monarchy's outward rhythm? These questions will not be answered in statements, but in patterns, the subtle choreography of appearances, absences, and emphasis. For now, one fact is clear. The decision has been absorbed, not resisted. That acceptance, cautious as it may be, signals recognition of authority. King Charles has asserted control not through spectacle, but through resolve. And in institutions shaped by history, resolve often speaks louder than tradition. The aftershocks are still traveling outward. But the center has shifted. And once that happens, nothing truly returns to how it was before. As the initial shock settles, a more sobering realization begins to take shape. This decision is not about a single moment. It is about direction. King Charles has not merely responded to pressure. He has chosen a path. And once a monarch does that publicly, even through silence, the institution begins to move with him. What lies ahead will not unfold dramatically. There will be no sudden announcements, no sweeping declarations meant to convince or comfort. Instead, the impact of this decision will be felt through subtle permanence. Patterns will change. Roles will quietly evolve. Influence will be redistributed not by decree but by proximity and trust. This is how real power moves inside old institutions, slowly, but irreversibly. King Charles now stands at a critical point in his reign. For years, he was seen as a transitional figure, someone meant to preserve stability until the next generation fully emerged. Today's move challenges that assumption. It signals intent. It suggests that he does not see his role as temporary stewardship, but as active leadership shaped by conviction. That distinction matters deeply. Monarchies endure not because they avoid decisions, but because they choose carefully when to act. By making this choice now, King Charles has acknowledged that waiting carried greater risk than action. That calculation reveals both urgency and awareness, an understanding that unresolved tension eventually becomes institutional weakness. Observers should pay close attention not to what is said next, but to what quietly follows. Which engagements are prioritized? Which voices appear more frequently at his side? Which initiatives receive visible support? These are the signals that will confirm how lasting this shift truly is. There is also a personal dimension that cannot be ignored. King Charles has spent decades preparing for this role, often constrained by position rather than authority. Now, with the crown firmly his, the responsibility is no longer theoretical. Decisions are no longer rehearsals. They carry consequence, not just for the monarchy, but for how history will judge his leadership. Public reaction, though measured, reflects this understanding. People sense that something has changed, even if they cannot yet articulate how. The absence of panic is telling. So is the absence of celebration. What remains instead is attention, focused, patient, and waiting. This moment also reframes the monarchy's relationship with transparency. By choosing action over explanation, King Charles has invited interpretation rather than instruction. That is a risk. But it is also a statement of confidence, a belief that outcomes will justify intent more convincingly than words ever could. For critics, questions will persist. Was this decision unavoidable? Could alternatives have been explored longer? Does decisive action now create uncertainty later? These are fair concerns. But history rarely rewards leaders who prioritize comfort over clarity. Institutions stagnate when uncertainty is allowed to linger indefinitely. Supporters, meanwhile, see something else entirely: a monarch stepping fully into his authority, willing to bear criticism rather than allow drift. They argue that continuity does not mean immobility, and that survival sometimes requires recalibration rather than preservation. Both interpretations may coexist for some time, but over months and years, only one measure will matter: whether the monarchy emerges more coherent, more stable, and more trusted than before. That outcome will not be determined today. It will be revealed gradually, through consistency rather than spectacle. One thing, however, is already clear. This decision has ended a period of hesitation. It has drawn a line between passive expectation and deliberate leadership. Whatever follows will be shaped by that choice. As Britain watches quietly, the monarchy moves forward not with certainty, but with intention. And in moments like this, intention is often the most powerful force of all. Because once a path is chosen, especially by a crown that carries centuries of weight, turning back is no longer an option. This is not the end of a story. It is the moment the story commits to its direction. And long after today's headlines fade, this decision may be remembered as the point where King Charles' reign stopped being anticipated and began being defined. Long before this shocking decision reached the surface, pressure had been building in ways the public could not see. Not through scandal or open conflict, but through accumulation, small unresolved issues stacking quietly until restraint itself became a liability. In institutions like the monarchy, such pressure does not explode. It compresses. And when it finally releases, the result often appears sudden, even shocking. Those close to palace operations describe a prolonged period of internal unease. Not dysfunction, but strain. Meetings grew heavier. Language became more cautious. Long-standing assumptions were revisited more frequently, often without resolution. These are the early signs of an institution approaching a threshold, a point where maintaining balance requires change rather than patience. King Charles was acutely aware of this shift. Unlike moments driven by public outrage or media urgency, this pressure came from within. Advisors raised concerns not about optics, but about sustainability. Could existing arrangements hold under increasing scrutiny? Could ambiguity continue without eroding authority? These questions lingered unanswered for too long. What complicates this moment is King Charles' personal history. He is not a monarch who arrived untested. Decades of preparation shaped his worldview, teaching him the cost of both action and delay. That experience likely informed today's decision more than any single event. He has seen how hesitation can weaken institutions just as surely as recklessness. There is also the weight of legacy. King Charles ascended the throne under the long shadow of continuity. Stability was expected, almost demanded. But stability does not mean stasis. Over time, preserving the form while neglecting the function becomes dangerous. Insiders suggest that this realization crystallized over recent months, turning reflection into resolve. Another layer lies in generational responsibility. The monarchy is no longer preparing for distant futures. It is managing present realities while safeguarding what comes next. Decisions made now will shape not only perception, but inheritance. That awareness adds urgency to moments like this. Delay ceases to be neutral. It becomes consequential. The emotional toll of such pressure should not be underestimated. Leadership at this level is isolating. Doubt cannot be shared freely. Debate must remain contained. When King Charles finally chose action, it was not impulsive. It was the release of long-held restraint. The shock, therefore, belongs not to the decision itself, but to how long it was withheld. Within the palace, this move has already altered behavior. Conversations feel more direct. Ambiguity has narrowed, while uncertainty remains. Direction does not. That clarity, even when uncomfortable, can be stabilizing. Institutions often breathe easier once the waiting ends. For the public, understanding these unseen pressures reframes the narrative. This was not disruption for its own sake. It was response to accumulation, a recognition that quiet strain left unresolved eventually undermines the very continuity it seeks to protect. History offers countless examples of institutions that failed not because they changed, but because they waited too long to do so. King Charles appears keenly aware of that lesson. Today's decision aligns him with leaders who act before erosion becomes collapse. As this story continues, the focus will return again and again to motive. Why now? The answer lies here in the unseen pressures, the internal recalibration, and the recognition that leadership sometimes requires choosing discomfort over decay. This moment, then, is not an interruption of continuity. It is an attempt to preserve it by acknowledging that continuity must evolve to endure. And that understanding may prove to be the most consequential decision of King Charles' reign.